Hello. Today we're talking about the chemistry of life. And in talking about the chemistry of life, we are going to be talking about carbon based molecules. And carbon based molecules make up all living things. They are said to be the foundation of life. Now, you're also going to hear carbon based molecules called biomolecules or biological macromolecules. And ultimately, it all means the same thing. It's just a different wording for the same thing. So when we're talking about molecules that are made from carbon based, um, we have to address some of the very unique properties that carbon has. So one thing about carbon is that it is able to form bonds, covalent bonds specifically, with up to four other atoms, and that leads to a lot of versatility. It's like carbon's like the kid that can pick up multiple musical instruments and play them all, or play, four different sports with ease. Um, Carbon, because of that ability to be so flexible and bind with up to four other atoms, it can form what is called a straight chain. So this is carbon and hydrogen, and these little lines mean bonds. They mean specifically covalent bonds. So carbon bound to carbon, bound to carbon, coming off the side are hydrogens. And then in this example, kind of the same thing. So these are, again, the chemical structures of carbon-based molecules. And here we have like kind of like a little branch coming off. We call that a branch chain. And then this structure here, this we call a ring. See how carbon has made up like a circle? See carbon, 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 carbon. That's what the C's stand for. It makes up a circle, which is also, pretty cool that it's able to do that. And just as a side note, these double lines here, they're showing what's called a double bond. And that's just additional shared electrons. For our purposes in biology class, we don't need to know all the details. But another unique property about many carbon based molecules is that they are made up of little pieces, kind of like beads on a string, and those little pieces are called monomers. And those monomers, again, those little beads on a string, get put together to form a polymer. Okay, so poly meaning many, mono meaning one. So these rings here are the individual monomers that make up the entire thing, which is a polymer. And there are four groups of carbon-based molecules or biological macromolecules. We have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. The first group that we're talking about today are carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And they are the primary source of energy in living things. The monomer, this is an example of the structure of a carbohydrate. The monomer for a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide, or like glucose. Everybody can see glucose here. And I mean, carbohydrates, it's a lot of stuff always comes to mind when you think carbs or carbohydrates, like pastas, rices, bread, cereals, those sorts of foods. Moving forward, we have carbohydrates kind of grouped into either sugars or starches. And when we're talking about a monosaccharide, we're looking at this kind of structure here. And examples would be glucose and fructose. Again, monosaccharides, glucose is the monomer that makes up carbohydrates. Then we have disaccharides, the prefix di meaning two. Here's an example of a disaccharide. Sucrose and lactose are disaccharides. Again, you don't have to necessarily memorize these. Just these might be things that you see on food labels or hear spoken about. And then there are polysaccharides, and polysaccharides include starches, cellulose, and glycogen. And here's just some examples. Starch looks like this, and it is, as you can see, it's a polymer. There are many pieces here. It is still considered to be a carbohydrate. And then cellulose, another polymer. Both these are found in plants. Think starches like potatoes. And cellulose is kind of a little bit tough in plant structure. It gives plants like firmness and rigidity. And ultimately, organisms that consume cellulose often are specially kind of adapted to break it down because it's a little bit tough. When we talk about lipids, immediately you're probably thinking fats. Okay, so, and that's correct, you might think fats, oils, and then one that's a little bit lesser known is cholesterol. Lipids are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they're characterized by like a zigzaggy type structure. At the points here of the zigzag are carbons, and coming off of the carbons are hydrogens. So these are called fatty acids, these little zigzags. And again, fatty acids, they're also sometimes called fatty acid tails because they do kind of have like a tail type look about them. And they are made of primarily carbon and hydrogen. In addition, you may have thought of lipids or heard of fats as being, kind of bad for you. Ultimately, the negative association with fats has to do with high in calories, but being high in calories isn't a bad thing. Calories are energy, and lipids can be broken down as energy in living things. They actually store a lot of energy, which means they're high in calories. Lipids also make up cell membranes. So in this picture here, these little kind of lines sticking down here, those are part of what's called a phospholipid. And those are fatty acids. There are little zigzags there. And lipids are also used in making up hormones. So like cholesterol, testosterone, estrogen, so on and so forth. You also may have heard of saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids. And basically what that means is different, fats and oils have different structures, and a saturated fatty acid is a zigzag, if you will, that's all carbons and hydrogens, single bonds. See the single lines here. In an unsaturated fatty acid, you see it's not just all single lines. You'll see some double lines. And essentially being unsaturated means there's not as many hydrogens bound to the carbons. And that does lead to different kind of nutritional values and nutritional storages. And that's just based on the structure. In phospholipids, these make up cell membranes, and they have this area here called a phosphate head. And then the zigzag is a fatty acid tail. The phosphate head likes water and is polar. And the non-polar fatty acid tail does not like water. And that leads to the structural kind of orientation of the cell membrane. Next up, we're talking about proteins. Proteins are familiar to us because we learned about them when we talked about enzymes, and also when we talked about gelatin and jello and the structural protein collagen in the gelatin. So with that, there are 20 different amino acids that make up proteins. So amino acids are the monomers that make up the polymer called a protein. Proteins are also known as polypeptides. Oftentimes, if you notice from the last slide to this slide, we have this R here. That R means the group changes depending on what amino acid is present. And oftentimes when we're drawing out a protein, we just use a circle to represent the individual amino acids strung together. And notice this would be one amino acid here, bound to another amino acid and another amino acid, and between the amino acids are peptide bonds kind of holding them together. And primarily, proteins are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And they have a variety of functions. They're structural in cells in terms of muscles, hair, collagen. They can act as enzymes, biological catalysts, play a part in immunity and antibodies, act as transporters, and kind of control or regulate sending signals within living things. So they're very kind of varied. They serve a variety of jobs within living things, and they're really a central component and necessary for life. Here's an example of the amino acid hemoglobin, and see it has that kind of twisty shape. And should there be a mistake in one of the amino acids that's linked here in the hemoglobin, that could change the overall shape of the protein. And that would mean that that protein isn't going to work right, which would potentially be really bad for a living thing. Lastly, here we're talking about nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are DNA and RNA, and they're made of the monomer called a nucleotide. So this would be the structure of DNA. This here is a nucleotide, and this is a zoomed in version of the nucleotide. In the nucleotide, we have a phosphate group, a sugar, and then this here is a nitrogen base or a nitrogenous base. In terms of what does DNA and RNA do, DNA stores genetic information, and RNA takes that genetic information and uses it to build proteins. And I know that was a little long. My most sincere apologies. But I hope that was helpful to all of you. Thank you.